If we take impact on pelvic floor, and we are tumbling, we're jumping, there's a lot of high impact force within cheer, can cause in female athletes incontinence. And if you've got an athlete that then is coming to training worried that they're going to pee themselves, they're going to be more vulnerable. That athlete's coming in not feeling safe in your space.
How do we navigate being highly competitive and the fact that our sport is a lot of physical contact, with avoiding these kind of ignoring concussions and just being like, well, can you perform?
I sometimes think if you have to talk about culture all the time, then you're probably not doing culture.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cheer Biz Podcast. I got to be honest, you guys, I have been so excited for this interview. We actually had to reschedule it because I had a scheduling conflict. But we are sitting down today with Joey, and I should have asked before we started, Cuthbert? How do I say your last name?
Yeah, Gamper Cuthbert, okay. Yeah.
Cuthbert. Joey Cuthbert, who is the author of the book Squad Safe. And I had the opportunity to read this book and I loved it. It's sitting right here on my desk for those of you who are watching. It's a little bit well worn. I took it with me to Hawaii. I was reading it on the beach. Like, it is a really important read. And I believe I'd sent Jeff, or maybe I sent it straight to Joey, but I think having written a book for the cheer industry, I think this is actually probably one of the most impactful books written directly for cheer that no one knew needed to be written. So I think it has a lot of value to it. I'm excited to sit down with Joey. I'm excited to ask her some questions. I'm going to read what Joey wrote about herself as like her bio, and then I'm going to let her take over and introduce herself and her background and why we are where we are with her writing this book. But what Joey told us ahead of the interview was Joey is a former cheer athlete, coach, gym owner, and national team manager. She is now the founder of Squad Safe, a consultancy set up to advocate for safeguarding education in cheer and dance, and the author of a book by the same name, Squad Safe, a practical guide to athlete welfare and culture change in cheerleading. Joey also currently chairs the board of directors at Sport Cheer England, the national governing body for cheerleading in England, which is why, for you Americans listening, she has a very slight accent. So,
thank you.
Joey, would you mind introducing yourself and expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Dan. I'm really honestly honoured to have been invited on to talk about the book. Yeah, I mean, you've kind of said it really, but I guess for the Americans listening, and most of your listeners, I'm imagining, are from the US. Cheerleading's been going in the UK for about 30 years. So I'm considered not quite one of the OGs. I'm kind of like end of the first generation into the second generation of cheer athletes in our country. My background before cheer was that I trained professionally as a dancer. So for the majority of my cheer career, that was done in a way that it is for a lot of people in the sport. It was my hobby. And even when I started coaching, I coached originally as a hobby before it became my job and then a gym owner. So alongside that, I had a professional career in the dance industry in the UK. And that was that I trained. I was a performer for a short time, and then I moved into teaching and choreographing and working in dance education. So I kind of had this overview of both the sports, the art forms, and from lots of different perspectives, from being a participant, from being a competitor, from, being a coach and a gym owner. And so all of those things have kind of, hopefully given me lots of different perspectives. And now, as you said in the introduction as well, for the last 6 years, there's been an emerging national governing body for the sport, a federation in England. It gets a bit complex when you get into the UK because there's also a Welsh and a Scottish but we come together for Sports UK. But I chair the board at Sport Cheer England, and again, for me, that passion about regulation, governance, for me, it all comes down to how can we make our sport safer and more fun for the participants, because if it's not safe, it's not fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how can we do all those bits from how can we play our part in whatever role we have in the cheer industry? So I kind of come at it from lots of different angles.
So I have to ask, because this book was, I imagine, no small undertaking. What was the inspiration? Like when was that light bulb moment for you, if you can remember, of like, there's a problem here and I want to drive forward on finding a solution?
Yeah. So for a lot of my professional dance career, I worked in education management. So I would be organizing dance teachers that were going out and delivering sessions, or I was running a gym and I was managing coaches. And as part of that, in the UK, safeguarding training is mandated. So I would get somebody in to come and do training with them. And at the end of every session, the dance teachers or the coaches would come to me and they would say, "That's great, Joey, that we've done some training, but it's not really relevant to us. And also they've told us we can't touch kids. So how am I meant to spot a back handspring or hold a kid in the center so they can feel for their pirouette, or, correct someone? How am I meant to do that? How, if we're a gym, are we meant to do safe communication when we've been told we can't, put them in a WhatsApp group or whatever it is?" And I would end up spending a good hour after every time we'd had a service provider come in, figuring out with my staff how we would do that. And I kept saying, at some point, someone's going to write a course that's specific to our industry. It makes sense. And when they do, that will be the person that I employ to come and deliver our training for us. And it wasn't until 2020 I watched Athlete A on Netflix, which was the documentary about the systemic abuse within USA gymnastics, that I realized no one was coming to do this work for us. And if we wanted to do it as an industry, we were best placed to know what the needs were of our industry, and we needed to do it, and that no one was coming to do it for us. And I had already, in some of the roles that I was doing, taken on safeguarding lead roles within those organizations. So I picked up the phone to the people that I'd done all my qualifications with and said, how do I get more qualified so that I can begin to write and do this work? And what happened first was I got more qualified, and I wrote a course. I wrote a bespoke course for the cheer industry on safeguarding. And I thought, this is a no-brainer. Everyone's going to want this course. I'm not going to have to sell this course to the industry because we're all waiting for it, right? And actually, that wasn't the case. It was kind of a hard sell. And in the conversations I was having with gym owners, they were saying things to me like, yeah, we kind of want the course, but we also don't want it to look like we've got a problem. And if you came in and did training with us, it might look like we're identifying an issue. There was a lot of hesitancy within the sport, although people behind closed doors were saying to me they wanted it. And so I thought, maybe if I wrote a book, maybe you might not yet be at the stage where you are prepared to put all your staff through a training or feel like financially you see the value of a course, but you might pick up a book and you might read some stuff. So I started writing the book, but it was a kind of a 2-3 year process, because I was also at the same time, and we'll get into the book, I'm sure, in a minute, but I was doing a lot of reading around leadership, culture change, and I was realizing actually there's this huge intersection between all these pieces in our sport. How we do good leadership is how we create safe spaces. How we create safe spaces is how we safeguard athletes. And so actually there was probably a year of reading and marinating on how all these things intersect before I started writing. But for me, the trigger was really about, how do I get information out to people that makes them passionate about thinking we can do this as an industry. We can be the change that we want to see, rather than waiting for someone to come along. So yeah, that was the start of the book.
Okay, so I have to ask, has the UK had any significant events in the cheer industry? So I think US listeners may have a slightly different perspective, where they're like, we don't need to admit something is wrong. It's been all over the news. We had our our own athlete A-ish kind of reckoning, our blacklist reckoning that kind of came out, and it was right around the COVID time frame, and all of a sudden all of these things started to come out, to include very prominent gym owners who were under investigation by our Federal Bureau of Investigations, and just a number of things that had gone on, where I think in the US there is less of that hesitancy of like, oh, this looks bad, and more of a, yeah, we know there's problems. Has the UK faced any issues like that, or has it still been avoided?
I mean, it's not been without cases, but it's not had the huge high profile cases that the US has had. And actually it has been some US gyms that have, back in 2020, that were reluctant when I was having those conversations, because they were maybe concerned about being associated with the press that was happening at that time. You know, they were saying they knew that there was an issue, but I think across all countries that I've worked with, and because no one else has been doing quite what I was doing, at least back in 2020, I had quite an international reach. You know, I've delivered safeguarding training for cheer in France, in Italy, Australia. I think people think they're okay until they're not okay. You know, I haven't had an incident in my gym, so we're probably doing safeguarding right, kind of thing. I mean,
you don't need your seatbelt until you crash your car.
Right, like, absolutely. And to be honest, the high profile cases in the US did impact us here. You know, they had that ripple effect, because the US is where we look to for the sport in terms of it being, you know, the leader in the sport. Those cases did impact. They did have that ripple effect, and I think it was the like you said, the start of our, not quite Me Too movement, but you know, it was that moment, that of that kind of awakening for the sport to say we might have a problem.
No, not might. So as we look at this, and I think, I'll be honest, when I picked up Squad Safe, I had the impression of it was going to be all about protecting athletes from physical and sexual abuse, was going to be the primary focus of the book. You know, that is what a lot of us think of when we think of athlete safeguarding. What are we doing to make sure athletes are not physically or sexually or tertiarily mentally abused in the gym? That's what a lot of the safeguarding training that is provided, at least by the USASF, focuses on. That is kind of the focus, and reasonably so, because those are obviously horrible things that we do want to ensure we're not contributing to in the industry. But your book goes so much deep. Like, that's where I was really blown away reading it. Is it looked like you went into it with this, like, okay, I'm going to create some safeguarding training on how do we spot athletes, how do we do these things, and then you started to pull on that thread, and it just kept unraveling. And I imagine you went on this journey of like just down the rabbit hole of how everything interconnects, which I want to dive into some of those things a little bit later, because that's where I really found the book super fascinating, because there's some really interesting things that you talk about in here that I had never thought of as a coach. So getting to that in a second. Well, actually, was it like that for you, or did you know that this was going to go that direction and you wanted to touch on all of these like more not thought of issues?
I mean, it was a bit like that. It was a bit of a rabbit hole. I had plans to have the book published earlier than it was. And it was delayed for all sorts of reasons in terms of me being able to finish writing. But what happened during that time was new bits of research would come out, different sports science. And I'll go, oh God, no, that interconnects. That needs to be included in the book, because that's so important to this, that, and it was a bit of a rabbit hole. And there's so much more that I could have written. You know, this is kind of although it's quite in-depth, it's also quite a whistle-stop tour of, yes, here's some things that you could be thinking about if you suddenly find yourself super interested in one thing. You should go off and read more. You know, it's not, but it was like that, because you could, this is about how do we create a safe culture, and really asking what is culture? What is culture? How do we build it in our gym? and how does that contribute to the success of our athletes? And I say success in a really broad, the broadest sense, success in terms of their health and welfare, but also their elite performance, because, as I sort of go on and demonstrate in the book, creating that culture leads us to the same point that we're trying to get to. We all want to build elite athletes, have successful wins at competition, and I think often when we think about athlete welfare and safeguarding, we often think of this quite binary choice of like, either you've got a nicey environment where it's soft and cuddly and we're a rep team and we don't really compete, or we have this very harsh environment where we're very successful. And actually, I believe there's a third way, that we can do both.
So let's dive into it. So what is culture? Because you said we got to kind of define that. So what is it?
Yeah. So culture has got many layers to it. I best describe it in the book as using like a kind of an onion model. Like we're peeling away these layers of what it is in our gym or our organization. And, that first layer of culture, which is often what people think of as when they're talking about this is our culture that we outwardly show, what we say on our website, what we say our values are, our mission statement, how we present ourselves, what our gym looks like, the environment, the physical environment that we create, and the advertising that we externally talk about as our gym, and the things that we say that we do. But then if you've worked in any organization, you will know that often once you get behind the curtain, what you say you do and what actually happens is not necessarily the same thing. And it's not always a bad thing. I've worked in places where I've gone in at the start and said, oh, how do I find or do X, Y, and Z? Because you've said in your, your staff handbook, you do it this way. And they'll say, oh, we used to do it that way. But we don't do it that way anymore. We do it another way because of, budgets or whatever it is. And it's not that the new way is bad necessarily, but it's not what we said we would do. So this kind of layer of culture of what's happening underneath. There's what we say we do, there's what we do, and then there's all the people that make up our organizations, our coaches, our athletes, our parents, and how they interpret those first two layers that we kind of get down to, their own experiences that they come with, their personalities, their own values, whether those align with your gym or not. Everyone comes with their own backgrounds, and so we've got this kind of melting pot. And yes, as gym owners, we can't control everyone, everyone coming into our gym being like us, and we don't want them to. We want this rich tapestry of all of these people, but what we want is to set within that a framework to say, this is how we do things in our gym. This is the culture that we want to create. And so the start of the book, when people, like, you're right, you open the book thinking, right, this is going to be about how I stop people physically assaulting my athletes. And actually the start of the book is, how do we identify our values, our mission, our purpose? How do we live that out in a way that isn't just lip service and, isn't gaslighting our athletes? I think one of the things that I mention in the book, which is my real bugbear, is all the, Instagram hashtag we are family, because if you're in a gym that doesn't feel like family, yet it's telling you this is family, that's quite a conflicting, how are you as an athlete meant to raise your, express how you feel about your experience in that gym, because you're being told it's not the experience you're having. So I think culture for me is the everything, but what are our controllables? That's what I talk about in the gym. How do we control? And really and truly, if you don't intentionally build it, it will be built for you. And I think this is what a lot of gym owners, when I go on to, the coaches forums, and they're talking about, the parents are controlling our culture, or we've got these athletes in our gym that are behaving a certain way, that are creating a certain environment. That's the culture. So how 100%. Do we, yeah.
I have a couple things that I want to dive into on that. With culture, I loved everything that you said, especially just now. And you also said it in the book, how, what you put on your website, what you put on your marketing, and that some of that gaslighting stuff that goes on, that can break down at a lot of levels. So the gym owner can be very well intentioned and set these core values and set their mission statement and do all of those things. But then, like you said, you get behind the curtain and the actual implementation is very different. What do you find are some of the consistent reasons why culture doesn't get executed the way the gym owner intends? And now I would say we're operating from the perspective of, I think there are a small number of gym owners out there that are like, yeah, I don't really care about the kids. I care about winning, like that. But I think that is, if those people that exist are the vast minority of gym owners that I talk to. Most of them are very well intentioned. They care about kids. They care about the sport. So and I'm not saying they're not part of the problem, but where do things tend to go off the rails? Why do you see that disconnect from I'm well intentioned, I set my core values, I have a mission statement, to that doesn't actually happen?
I think one of the things that's quite hard is we don't really have this may be like a left, stay with me, but one of the things that I think is the problem is we don't really have an off season in cheer. We don't often set this cadence within our gym calendar where we have training for our staff that has the time to, we might have some training for our staff, but the time to really focus on embedding how do we do what we do in a way that embeds the values, mission, purpose? How do we do culture? Because we don't have the time. Because if I've got a short amount of time and I've got to do staff training and I need first aid training to be completed by my staff, and I really, really need half my staff to understand that we do a certain grip in a certain way because we're not looking consistent on the floor and we've got competition in another week and this is our only time, those things take a backseat. I also think sometimes we think we're doing it when we're not. You just assume that people will assimilate it. You've given you've got a new coach, you've told them, hey, read our website, and you've assumed that they're coming in because there's value alignment when there may or may not be. So the first thing is, I don't think we give enough time to really think, okay, well, if our value is X, let me think of one. If our value is, so I work with an organisation at the moment that has 4 strong values: teamwork, safe, growth, and empowerment. And every decision that we make, we say, is this an empowering decision? Is the way that we're doing this growing? What like asking those questions. How are we translating it? Is that, we're giving our staff the opportunity to think about that. The other thing is the metrics by which we reward behaviours. And I don't mean behaviours of the athletes, I mean reward behaviours of staff. So culture is like values plus behaviour. And behaviour we can incentivize, and the people that are demonstrating the values, you incentivize them by promoting them so that they role model that in senior leadership positions. So there's a way of kind of incentivizing behavior that supports the values to create your culture. So I think maybe it's that we just assume it kind of happens, and actually culture needs to be quite intentional. And I agree with you. I think, I've had conversations with gym owners where they've said, you're tiring us all with this brush that we don't really care and all we care about is winning. And actually, we really do care about the kids. And I do genuinely think that you're right. Gym owners do. We all, and coaches, a lot of them. And even the ones that you might look at and say, well, that's not the way I'd coach, or I think that's really harsh, or that coach is being abusive. Actually, underneath all of that, there is probably good intention that's being executed
poorly,
not the way that they want, the way they'd hoped to. They just don't necessarily know another way or have the time. If the metric by which they are being measured is winning, and they've got this way of doing that, then that's what they're going to keep doing until we give them an opportunity to explore another way.
Yeah, I was, as you were talking earlier and as you kind of verified, I feel like the biggest things that hold us back are time. Just in general, time of the owner to focus on that. Like as an owner, you have so many things you have to think about. payroll, advertising, getting more kids in the door, like all of these things to keep the business going. And then you're looking at, a lot of owners coach teams, and then who is responsible for driving that culture forward. And then the demand to win, I think, tend to be the two frequent things that I see get in the way of a well-intentioned culture, because there is an expectation from coaches, from athletes, from parents that you're going to be competitively successful in a lot of these programs. And so those two things often run in conflict with intentionally building culture because it takes so much time. Would you say that there is a ideal amount of training or time that should be invested into culture and into safeguard, building these positive safeguarding practices on a consistent basis?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I don't think I've been asked that before, or that I've necessarily thought about that before, actually. But I think maybe setting some time aside as an owner to think about how you're going to embed it means that what I would really love is for us to get to a place in our gyms where it's just woven into the fabric of the way that we do things. And that's when you truly got a culture, right? So that kind of an intentional way of doing things. I think that fear of like spending too much time on it, and therefore we're not spending time focused on winning. I actually think there's a lot in our culture that is going to help us win. There's a lot of things that we could be doing to support athletes, particularly around how we create psychological safety. And I know you've had Jeff Benson on before talking about psychological safety. If we want environments where our athletes are going to be able to throw skills confidently, they need to be safe to be able to do that without fear of all sorts of things. So creating that psychological safety has a knock-on effect on skill acquisition for our athletes. We are doing the winning. And the other thing that it does, if we can create these positive environments where our athletes are coming in feeling confident, safe, etc., is athlete retention. Because I see it's really interesting when you get the big world's gyms that seem to have a different cycle of kids every year. People go to there'll be gyms where kids will go, they'll go for one season, they'll get their world's title, but they don't stay. We don't want that. We want to be able to home grow our kids, and for them to be our world's team, and for them to want to stay because there's something about it that feels like home, feels like the place they want to be. But that's an interesting question. I've never been asked if there's a specific amount of time that we should be spending on it,
or a ballpark goal. I think, because what I see a lot of people do, and I'm looking mostly US, Canada based. Those are the majority of gyms that I work with through Next Gen and through Dream Camps and people that we see. Most people will do our mandatory USASF required training. We'll do our darkness to light training, which is about an hour and a half of video with some very basic quizzes. And then maybe a all staff meeting once a year where you review what the mission statement is and what our core values are, and talk about it for about an hour or so. And then it's, from a training perspective, it's not really touched on. Now, it may be reinforced, and the best gyms do reinforce it throughout the year, but I'm even looking critically at, we have a pretty good meeting tempo with my team. Head coaches meet weekly, all staff meet monthly, and we very rarely discuss culture, do any sort of cultural assessment, except for that once a year. And I'm wondering if that's not enough. Now, I do think we have a good culture. We do some things to reinforce culture in our program, so it's not neglected, but from a training perspective, we're not necessarily touching on it. And I found myself, as I was reading the book, being like, well, we have never talked about that.
And you know what? I think there's a difference between, I sometimes think if you have to talk about culture all the time, then you're probably not doing culture. Like, it's about the contributing factors that make up your culture. So, in the book, I talk about female athlete health. and
That's the
how
one that I
what are the
was
considerations
mind
around
blown.
sports science that we're thinking about
Mhm.
doing. So it doesn't mean that we sit down every week and go, how are we doing our environment? But it might be that we go, right, have we got enough sanitary products in our bathrooms so that if an athlete's caught short, then they're okay? Like, that's culture. That's about enhancing the environment. So maybe it's about people slightly shifting their idea of what culture is in terms of how we do it on the daily basis in the gym. It's about the things that contribute to and build to the environment that we want to see. And some of that's about the language we use, some of that's about the certain coaching styles. And yes, those probably do require meetings with our teams, because you probably stylistically want to agree as a team that you do things a certain way. But the other things are what are the practical things that we're contributing on the daily that make up that safe environment.
So what are behaviors that contribute to not building a safe environment? What are things that gym owners or even coaches should have pop up in the back of their mind as like, oopsie, I shouldn't be here, or this is a red flag, this is something that we should pay attention to?
I mean, I think if a gym owner, I think if a coach is able to red flag themselves, that would be, they're probably doing some good self-reflection.
Or maybe red flag like a co-coach, right? I'm working with this person and like, we might be, or even it could be outside of themselves, but like, I'm looking at my team, there's a warning sign here that culturally there's some misalignment and I need to pay attention. So what are, if anything, I'm trying to not ask you the basic questions, by the way. I could have just asked you about really easy things. I'm trying to challenge you a little bit. So what are some things that gym owners should look out for and that like coaches should look out for as like signs that culture is not aligning?
So I think one of the reasons I think it's so important that we have like our codes of conduct, that our coaches understand the values and behaviors that we expect, is that it means that red flags stick out a lot more. Because if everyone's just operating on their own standards, doing their own thing, there's not really a particular standard in the gym. What you do is you foster an environment where it might not necessarily be abusive, but then if abuse were to happen, it kind of flies under the radar because you have no standards. So then if someone does something that's out of line with those, like for example, if your gym, like all the coaches privately message kids all the time on their phones to, let's say, very, genuinely they are figuring out when they are going to see them for a private practice or whatever it is, telling the rescheduling times. If that's what's just regularly happening in your gym, if you've then got a coach that decides to private message a kid inappropriately, it flies under the radar because everyone's doing it. So there's something about setting standards that helps those that are best intentioned to identify others that are out of line. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I think is really important, is around the way that we hands-on spot kids, and about helping not just for us to identify red flags from other coaches, but to help our athletes understand where they should be touched if they're going to be spotted. Body autonomy, consent. If I have everybody in my gym always be like, if I'm going to spot your back walkover, I'm going to, is it okay? I'm going to put my hand on your lower back and your upper thigh. And then you have somebody come into the gym and go, well, to spot your walkover, I need to put my hand between your legs. The athlete is identifying that that's not where it is. I mean, there's so much happening in that, isn't there, for everyone. So I'm kind of, that's an extreme example, but what we're doing is kind of, by reinforcing the behaviors we want to see, we more easily and readily identify the ones that we don't. And I think helping everybody in the gym talk about, I don't have to say to an athlete, and if a coach says to you this, that's wrong, because they all know what's right and what's expected standards. So I haven't quite answered your question.
That's okay. I mean,
yeah.
You're saying set standards and that will help identify red flags. So what are, in your opinion, some across the board, every gym should have them standards that everyone should be making sure that they have this standard in place. It sounds like clear communication on hands-on spotting would be one standard. And I think you've kind of explained what you think is best practice, what you would recommend as best practice there, clear communication of what they're going to do. And for clarification, for the people who immediately dismiss things and listen when they're listening, you're not saying you do that every single time you spot a child. Like, if I spot you on a back walkover, then the next time I spot you on a back walkover, I'm going to say, I'm going to place my hand on your lower back and your thigh and do that every single time you spot them. I'm assuming that's not what you're recommending.
No, I actually did a session with a group of gymnasts from the gymnastics coaches from the US who got very hung up on the number of times you should request consent. And, if I'm going to spot 5 in a row, do I ask every time? And I'm saying, well, no, there's kind of a level of assumed consent once we've done the first one. But if I was going to suddenly switch up the skill and do something completely different, I'd want to tell the kid where I'm going to hold them. I mean, with back walkovers, we want our kids to know how to do that so they can do it for each other, don't we? Save our backs as well. But I think I think it's about, clear communication, consent. I guess you're asking what might be some other things that I would expect would be.
What are other standard practices? So you mentioned the messaging one, which I will be completely honest, I struggle the most with this one because kids just text, right? And when it's like, hey, coach, I'm going to be late. I don't necessarily want to be like, create a new text message because I'm in the middle of practice or getting ready for practice with athlete and mom and say, Sarah just told me she's going to be late for practice. I'm responding okay with you in the message. Like, sometimes it's just easier to be like, thumbs up or drive safe. And I understand you're saying if you build that culture within your gym, that kids theoretically won't do that. Awesome. I think that is a really good point. So what are, especially in this technological age, because it's really challenging. And I think we went a little bit too far afield initially with that knee-jerk response when everything happened, where it was like, you can't interact with kids on social media, you can't tag them, you can't it was basically it was just hard Berlin Wall, no interaction, and it wasn't realistic, and it just set everyone up for a failing standard. Now, do I think you should message kids on social media? No, I don't. I don't think you should Snapchat kids. I don't there are some very obvious ones, but to say a coach should never follow an athlete's public Instagram account, that's a little bit weird, because how am I supposed to mentor this kid and say, hey, that post, it wasn't appropriate. We need to pivot on this one, or, help along that process. So there are some interesting challenges on that one. So I'd be curious what you think your best practices are. It's kind of like you said, how are we supposed to communicate with kids if they said we can't put them in a WhatsApp group? What are we supposed to do there? So what are best practices in your mind on the communication in this digital age where things are very complicated? And what are any other good standards to have in place at your gym to ensure we're creating those standards where red flags do stand out?
When we are looking at social media, and you're right, it's a complete constantly evolving minefield, but transparency is really important, and it's not just about protecting the athlete, it's also about protecting us as the coach.
Totally.
And again, it goes back to that thing about, if everyone's doing something a certain way, then when someone deviates from the norm, it goes unnoticed. So as much as possible, creating boundaries with athletes that protect you as a coach as well. Because I think what I've seen happen on numerous occasions where coaches have told me, we only use the WhatsApp groups for communicating changes of times to practices or this, that, and the other. But of course, then they've got the coaches' phone numbers because they're in the WhatsApp group with them. The genie's kind of out the bottle at that stage. And then an athlete has decided that they want to make a disclosure, tell them something's going on at home to them, and so they message them personally rather than going through whatever the channels are. It's not to say that coach shouldn't be responding to that safeguarding concern that's just been on their phone, but it leaves that coach rather vulnerable, because there is going to be a question, Why are they messaging you with that? Why have they got your personal phone number? Why have they got, you open yourself up to a lot of questions, and that's not to say you couldn't answer those questions, but it's about how do you reduce the amount of vulnerability that you have for yourself as a coach, as well as protection of the athletes. There's loads of great technologies that we can utilize, different apps like Band and Spond, and different ways of communicating with coach groups.
How is Band different? So I'm curious, and we're probably diving down a rabbit hole that we don't need to dive down. So I won't be too confrontational throughout. But how is Band different? Because you can still set up a private message between two people. I don't know of many apps that don't allow for the ability to message someone privately. So they can still message a coach privately on Band. They can still, like, yes, it's not a phone number, but I can't log into Band and necessarily see every single private message. Most gym owners will say, yeah, these parents created their own private message group to talk smack about something in Band.
There's an element by which what you're doing with safeguarding is risk assessment and risk management, right? So yes, you're right that there is still risk, but are you creating less risk? And are you creating a digital audit trail that, if it was required, could be subpoenaed? So if it's someone's personal phone as opposed to their work phone, or a work band, how easily that could be digitally accessed if it needed to be for legal reasons. I mean, that's slightly.
No, I'm with you. I think,
but that is, part of it's about the risk management. Does it actually make that much difference? Maybe, maybe not. I would rather say that I'd done it and done the things that I could do, that I could try to do, rather than having said, oh, well, it's probably not that different. That's just,
And I'm not sitting here saying throw your hands up in the air and say we can't control it. I think there should be absolute standards. I think in my opinion, there are some bugaboos out there that are not necessarily as big of issues. We've just decided that we've, as an industry, or some people have said, oh yeah, that thing's horrible, versus I think we can all agree that anything that is designed to disappear should never be used to communicate with athletes, with anyone, really. I think they're just horrible. Like a Snapchat style chat or anything, a vanish mode or anything like that. Those are, if I had a coach communicating with an athlete with those, it's in our policy. That's grounds for immediate termination. Like, that's just never acceptable in our program. And I think you can create those standards. It can just be really challenging to, I don't know. I've really struggled with this one because I don't want athletes to feel like they can't reach out. Like, I have had athletes reach out to disclose child abuse and say, I really need to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that is that we are seeing more of a generation where parents are asking kids to take responsibility for their own. We see at the same time as we have loads of parents in cheer that are very hands-on and want to know everything, we also have parents that, if we would send the message to the parents, they're never going to pass it on to the kid. If I'm going to send choreography to a mum, that kid will come in next week and go, oh, mum didn't even, mum doesn't check her emails.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to, there's an element by which how do I most effectively communicate with these young people, which is really frustrating and really hard to do. And you're right, you don't want them to feel like they can't reach out to you. But I think when it comes to being able to set up a mechanism that they can disclose abuse if they want to have some appropriate channels, like if there's a particular email address they can message or a particular way that they can do it, it safeguards you as well in that process. But you're right, this is really, really difficult. Social media is one of the things that is the hardest because it's consistently evolving, and young people are, my son, he's 13, he was like, please can I have Snapchat, because that's how everyone communicates every now. No one uses WhatsApp. And I went to some of the 20-year-olds that I work with and they were like, oh yeah, he's right, no one uses it. WhatsApp's obsolete, it's not cool anymore, it's
it's
and
not.
So you don't want it's so hard to know how to navigate all of this. And I think generally within safeguarding practice, the rule around how we help young people navigate social media is around how you need to treat young people. Don't have an offline and online life anymore. It's not like, I mean, Dan, I don't know how old you are, but I am old enough to have had one computer in our home. And if someone was online, it meant you couldn't use the phone, the dial up, all that kind of stuff. You could say to someone, you can't go on the internet. Now you can't say you can't go on the internet because everyone has a phone in their pocket, right? And that is how we communicate, and not just how we communicate with young people. That's how we do business. That's how, I have friends who are lawyers who say that their clients, use WhatsApp as a way of communicating with this is the way that everyone communicates now, right? So what do we do about that? And I guess we have to treat it as if it has a physical world. So if my 15-year-old daughter is going out to a house party for the first time, I'm going to say to her, make sure you walk home with a friend. Don't accept a drink from someone that you don't know. Don't take anything that you don't know what it is. We have to be helping our young people to navigate that space in that same way. So I guess as coaches, our responsibility is how can we help them? How can we help set them up for success in that? How can we not
and ourselves,
give them mixed
mentioned,
messages?
We want to set the kids up for success. We want to set the coaches up for success. I will tell you, one of the things that we're implementing next year at the start of the season to make things simple is through our system that we use within NextGen. Every coach is going to have a phone, like there's going to be a coach's phone number, and it populates to a system that I can see every text message. So now there is that audit trail of, hey, this is coach so-and-so's coaching phone number. It's a business phone number basically, but it can also just route directly to their cell phone. They just open an app instead of using their text. And that, because I've been trying to solve this audit trail problem, right? Like it's just such a challenge. And we have tried now for, I think, 4 years to tell kids, don't text your coaches personally. Or if you do, you include the parent in the text message. They never freaking do it.
Yeah.
And half the time the coaches are like, I just needed to send them a message. I just was like, how close are you? That was the message that popped up. So it's like, it becomes really challenging. But I was a police officer. I understand the perspective of like, create these situations where when a line gets breached, that red flag pops up and you can now intervene before something more serious is occurring. So, all right, we derailed a little bit, and that's totally my fault because I'm the interviewer. You talked in here about some stuff that I have never thought about female health in regard to my athlete, like female health specifically, in the in-depth way you did. I have literally never thought about the support that my athletes are wearing in their sports bras beyond to tell some athletes, hey, let's wear an actual supportive sports bra to practice because we don't need accidental things falling out during practice. Because you have those girls that want to come with the fashion. But I've not thought about it beyond that. And even thinking about menstrual health, we've thought about it from the perspective of we've always had feminine hygiene products at the gym, but I haven't thought about it from the way that potentially impacts performance and what's happening hormonally in the body. I would love to chat a little bit more about that, because that part of the book I was like just fascinated by, of like, wow, I've never thought of this. And then how does that impact how I coach my kids?
Yeah, because there's a real performance element to this around, like, when you talk about menstrual cycle, everyone immediately goes to the part of the cycle when a young woman will have a bleed and that maybe she's got stomach cramps and she can't train. But actually there's a part in the cycle, the cycle is the whole month, where actually they're optimized for performance, hormonally, so there's a lot in here. I mean, what happened for me, and this was when I'd already started writing the book, was I went to a conference where it was a women in sports conference. I was there with my Sport Cheer England hat on, representing the sport at an event. And I heard a woman called Dr. Emma Ross, who at the time she was at the English Institute of Sport. She was working with Team GB, preparing their female athletes for Rio, for the Olympics. And she gave a talk about female athlete health. I sat there and it was like this moment where I was like, oh my God, I've never thought about any of these things. And we are in a sport that is 98% female.
Absolutely.
We are not optimizing performance. We're not considering any damage that we may be doing to the female body. If you think about high impact sport, pelvic floor.
Oh, the pelvic floor stuff. I was like mind blown.
We're not optimizing our conditioning. A lot of people don't condition for skill specificity, let alone think about the female body in this space. You know, my mind was blown, and I was like, we need to think about this stuff. And at the same time, there was a documentary on television in the UK about, it was a woman who's now a sports presenter, but she had been a runner. A competitive runner as a young person, and actually pelvic health had been used by her coach as a way to create a scenario where he could then abuse her. And so my mind went, right, we definitely need to talk about all this stuff. How do we do it safely? And so I started a conversation with Dr. Emma Ross, which has been an ongoing conversation for the last few years. We ended up running a webinar together around how do we do this safely, because we do need to talk about it. We need to tackle it. And I think what's really interesting is that, I mean, we could go down a million rabbit holes on this, Dan, but even the biomechanics of the female pelvis versus the male pelvis, I even wonder if we should be teaching how we dip for a basket toss slightly differently to optimize performance because of the way that the
pelvis rotates.
The pelvis rotates. Right. So there's a lot in here that we can unpack. I think the reason I included it is because some of those things, if they're not addressed in the gym, for example, if we take impact on pelvic floor and we are tumbling, we're jumping, there's a lot of high impact force within cheer, can cause in female athletes incontinence. And if you've got an athlete that then is coming to training worried that they're going to pee themselves, they're going to be more vulnerable. They're going to hold themselves back socially. They're probably not going to give you a full out in terms of, they're not going to jump as hard because they're now nervous that they might do something to hurt themselves. And when you that athlete's coming in not feeling safe in your space. So how do we create an environment where they can be safe? And then also, how do we set them up so that those things aren't happening? Like, how do we educate ourselves as coaches and gym owners so that we are creating the right conditioning exercises, the right amount of training, that we're listening to our athletes and their bodies?
Yeah. I think so that particular section of the book, and it was very short, like it wasn't a super long portion of the chapter, but that was a huge aha, holy moly, I've not thought about this moment, because I've had a lot of athletes who struggled with this. Like, it is, especially when you get to elite tumblers, you start getting into the level 6s. It's very common that in my experience that girls will pee while they're tumbling. And so it's always okay, we're going to tumble. And they run to the bathroom to try and empty their bladder because they just have accepted that it's just what happens. And you talked about in the book, there's some products that are have built-in pads and things like that to help reduce that. But that's a symptom solution. We're trying to solve for the symptom, not solve for the problem. And I can remember way back to when I had a male coach that was working in my gym, and he was a very flamboyant coach. And his joke was always oh, well, she's not a virgin anymore. And I'm like, the girl's 12. That's not actually what the problem is. But that was their and they didn't say it to the athlete, but that was their snide comment behind the scenes, and they don't work for me anymore. But I remember there were many athletes, female athletes even, or coaches that would tell me, oh yeah, that's because they, are sexually active. And I'm like, I don't think those two correlate. That doesn't actually make sense. Now I know, my wife will tell you, yeah, I had kids, and now when I sneeze, it's you don't know what's going to happen. But ultimately that goes back to pelvic floor health and what happens to the female anatomy when they push out a child. So I just found that fascinating. But where I got stuck, and this is what I love / slightly hate about your book. Okay. So love you, but slightly hate this, because you bring up a lot of problems and you get us thinking, but not all of them have, here's the answer. It's,
Right.
which I get. I'm giving you a hard time because this book would be this thick, much thicker if it was like, here's the problem and here's the exact solution. So volume 2, looking for squad safes, do these things to not be dumb. That can be the subtitle. How, as a male, do I talk to my female athletes about their pelvic floor health in a safe way? Because that's a challenging discussion. And secondary question, is there any really good programs out there for implementing conditioning to improve pelvic floor health within our athletes?
Yeah. Good. So the first thing that's really important to make sure all your listeners know, which maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't, I might be teaching everyone something I know, but everyone has a pelvic floor. Men and women have a pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor are the muscles that support. It's just that women also have a uterus in there. They have additional organs, but your pelvic floor is the muscles that are like a sling within your pelvis, holding up the uterus and all of your organs that you've got going on in there. So when we jump or when we high impact, there is impact on that pelvic floor. And in women, because there is more in there, it tends to be more vulnerable to that impact. And there are things that you can do to strengthen pelvic floor. And I'm not suggesting that we should necessarily be doing loads of pelvic floor strengthening exercises in the gym. I think there are things that there are certain exercises that are a bit damaging to pelvic floor that we need to either restrict or find other ways to do. But what I think we need to do as a sport is to get better at understanding anatomy. And I think that's one of the challenges I find about coaching courses in cheer is that if you're a coach in another sport, you tend to have anatomy as part of your course curricula, and we don't have so much of that. We have loads of coaches who have people running laps because, I don't know, that's how you warm up. And now let's do something now let's jump. And you're like, well, what have we warmed up of jump? Or now we're going to do handstands. Well, we haven't warmed up our wrists. I'm being slightly facetious, but we don't necessarily know why we're warming up, what we're warming up, or how we're doing it. That's the way we've always done it. And we need to learn, we need to understand anatomy a lot more. And I think with a lot of these issues around female health, it's about, in terms of the language we use and the way that we address issues, is about being matter of fact about it. Being matter of fact in terms of anatomy and thinking about it in terms of performance. So sports bras is a performance issue. One of the pieces of research that Emma Ross did was with marathon runners, and they took half of them wearing a sports bra and half of them not, and they all had a roughly the same time that they ran at. They ran a marathon, and not wearing a sports bra put the equivalent of was the equivalent of running an additional mile on the body, because it slowed them down, because you had drag and movement. Well, now if I want an athlete to get from my third panel across to my panel 8, it's a performance issue, right? If I want them to have less movement when they're tumbling, so that they, so I think there's something you can set things like that up within your athlete pack at the beginning of a season. So you have a reference point. So if you do have to mention it, it's not awkward, like you're bringing it up for the first time. You can say, hey, how in our start of season pack, we talk about this. Can I direct you, signpost you to that? I think one of the reasons that I don't give loads of solutions in the book around some of these topics is that I'm not a sports scientist. And what I wanted to not do was overstep my place as a safeguarding educator, but I wanted to bring these issues to the fore and to say to people, we need to be doing more research around these. We, as an industry, as individuals, can be taking responsibility for that as well, and thinking about how we do it in our gym. Emma has written a really great book called The Female Body Bible, which I can give you a link to so that you can give that to your
Yeah, we can
listeners.
include it in the show description. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah. And her, along with two others that she now runs an organization with called the Well HQ, they offer a free course on the Open University that is around female health. There's a lot of research and information starting to emerge in this area, but not cheer specific. So as cheer coaches, we need to be going, okay, well, that's a piece of research around rowers, but actually, how does that translate to my athletes? Because if we're really serious about our athletes being elite, we should be interested in nutrition, health, performance elements. And I think as a sport, we're so focused on skills that sometimes we forget that there's all these other contributing factors. We're just worried about, can they do the grip, or can they whatever it is, and we're not necessarily thinking about what else could be enhancing performance, making them feel more confident.
And there's added complexity in our sport because most of the research centers around adult females. We're working with athletes that are transitioning from prepubescent to pubescent to postpubescent. And that is really, there's a lot of change in the body happening in there as well. And so it's even more important because the decisions that we make now, I not to put too much gravitas on this, but the decisions you make as a coach and the way you train your athlete and the potential stressors that we put on their bodies can have a very long-term effect when they're now 25, 30 years old and we've destroyed their pelvic floor. And full transparency, you putting it in the book made me think about it, but my brother actually got certified. He's a fitness person and he got certified in pelvic floor health and training specifically for maternity. And so he works with like training women who are pregnant and how to like strengthen their pelvic floor to make the labor process much less laborious. Yeah. And so it was really interesting to think about, but he had a long conversation with me way back when he first started learning about it, where he was like, it is crazy how big of an impact this has on female adult health. And we can be doing damage to this at a young age. So that's where it really stood out to me as like, wow, I've never thought about this.
I mean, only 6% of all sports science research is done on women, full stop. Only 6%.
Without even factoring in children.
And there are some reasons why, because women's throughout their life, female hormone fluctuations mean that it's really hard to get a group that's like a median group, to base your variables on, and that makes it more expensive. But there is emerging research. I think generally sport is realizing that it does need to do more in this area for women's health, in terms of not damaging them, also optimizing performance. And from my perspective, there being this athlete welfare dynamic to it. I think, one of the reasons I've been asked loads of times, why did you write Squad Safe just for the cheer industry? You could have written it, even my publisher wanted it to be what they called sport agnostic, like make it for all sports, because you could translate this into any sport, right? You said, yeah, well, that's what they wanted. And my discussion with them was that actually, I think within the cheer industry, unless it's made for us, we tend not to pick it up. We tend not to and actually we need to, in other sports, if I'm a rugby coach, I might go and look at what they're doing in American football. I'm going to go and look at what they're doing in cricket if they've got some really interesting piece of, at the moment, I'm really interested in the research that they're doing in the Rugby Football Union in the UK around concussions, because guess what, we do a lot in cheerleading. But unless there's, so that we've got to get a little bit more curious as cheer coaches, I think, to look at what else is okay. The funding isn't in cheer sports science research at the moment, so where is it and how can we utilize it?
I think some of that is symptomatic of we've been told so long that we're not a sport. And so we now disassociate ourselves from other sports. I think some psychologically, like a cheer person would pick up a gymnastics book more likely than they'd pick up a football book. But I will say 100%. It is challenging. So one of my favorite books is Coach's Guide to Teaching or A Teacher's Guide to Coaching. What is it? Yeah, The Coach's Guide to Teaching, sitting behind me. It's a phenomenal book, but it's written about soccer. And I made my whole staff read it together, and they couldn't handle it. They were like, I don't get this, because they don't know soccer. And so they're like, how do I backwards engineer this for cheerleading? And I'm like, ignore the soccer example and look at how they're talking about how people learn and retain information. That's really what we're getting out of this. So it is a little more challenging. I also want to touch on, because I was looking again at your chapters just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And although I gave you a hard time, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 do have some actionable steps. So you didn't just give us problems and no solutions. You talk about how to write your safeguarding policy. You talk about policies and documents you should have in your gym to support safeguarding. And I think you gave some really good examples and good ways to go about that. However, I think what's very important is to remember that chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 all are going to directly impact how you write those policies and how you write those documents, because they need to fit your gym and your culture. Would you agree with that? Like, you can't just pull someone else's document and say, this is mine now.
Yeah. And I think that's the problem when we treat regulation, whether that be safeguarding or risk assessments or any other kind of policy in our gym, when we just download a template, stick our logo at the top of it and say, cool, we have that done, because we need to bespoke it to the needs of our gym. I've seen gyms risk assessments that have included information that doesn't even, they're like, our fire exits are here, here, and here. And I'm like, really? No, they're not. So it's got to be bespoke to your gym. And, you don't.
ChatGPT can't write it for me?
Well, look, AI is a really useful tool if you give it the right information. ChatGPT is only as good as the prompts, right? So it's kind of the same thing. What I do think's interesting that you could utilize AI for is actually to feed it your policy and then to stress test your policy with case examples. Because there's two things. One, your policy is only as good as it being relevant to your gym environment, like you've just said, but also the only time that policy gets tested is when something goes wrong. That's when you discover that there's a gap in your policy that you hadn't thought about. So there's a couple of things. One is that you don't, I love that James Clear quote. I quote it in the book. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your system. So you can have all the good will and ambition in the world, but when it hits the fan, you're going to be reliant on whatever is in that policy, right? And so the policy's got to be watertight, and ultimately something will happen in your gym that you never thought of that isn't included in the policy. There's always, that policy should be like a live document that's always evolving. Something goes wrong, you didn't think about it, you need to change the policy so that next time it is included in the policy, whatever it is. But from that perspective, actually, AI is really interesting, because you could run your policy through ChatGPT and say, where are my vulnerabilities? Where are those vulnerabilities?
I love that. So I was being somewhat tongue in cheek. I talk about AI all the time. I use it regularly, but it's not a lazy tool. It does speed things up, but you can't use it to be lazy. So I was trying to kind of remind people, hey, look, don't go to ChatGPT and say, hey, write me a safeguarding policy for athletes for my cheer gym. If you need that as a starting point, maybe, but you really are going to need to refine that. And I think stress testing your policy, you can have it clean it up for language. Hey, make sure this is clear. And you could write out, these are all the things I want to make sure I'm protecting my athletes from. Help me draft this into a robust policy. That could be a starting point. And then you could stress test through it. So I think you can use it, but like you said, you've got to have good prompts, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that I've seen quite a bit is gyms that have had like a lawyer write their policy. And so even I struggled to read the policy, how a policy shouldn't be like a weighty tome that no one understands. It should be an actionable document that you're like, okay, this has happened. I can go, firstly, there should be a content page. Loads of people don't include content pages. So I can just go right down and go, okay, I need to do like a manual for how to do what you do, how you know, a living, breathing thing. And I think so, yes, you might want a lawyer to look over it and make sure that it is, or you do want a lawyer to make sure that that aspect of it is covered, but it's got to be readable. I actually did some work with a dance company that works with adults with learning disabilities, and they wanted to create a version of their policy that all of their adults with special educational needs would understand. And when we got to the end of creating these policies, they went, "How we all need those." We all need those versions, like actually, because we need like it needs to be quick, easy, and readable, you know, and understandable.
It should be a third grade reading level, which in general, writing should be at a third grade reading level to make it easy to understand and easy to implement. So love that. Can I derail us for 1 second and go back to something? We're starting. I don't know how much time you have, but you mentioned researching concussions with rugby and some stuff like that, and you talk briefly about concussion in the book, and you also talk about the repeated kind of micro traumas. That's another section that really got me thinking, because this is a really hard thing in our sport. I'm just going to be vulnerable with it and say, athletes, we don't have a large bench, if you have a bench at all. And when you have that kid who has a hard catch, or someone, you know, steps into the wrong way in the formation and collides with another athlete and they hit their head on their shoulder or something like that, and you're the day before a competition, 99% of coaches are saying, I mean, are you good? Like, what, can you make it? Can you push? And realistically, that's probably not from a health and safety perspective, not the best route always. And diagnosing concussions is very hard. I've seen athletes get minor bumps and actually have legitimate concussions, and athletes have what look like they're horrible falls, and they're like, "Nah, I'm fine. Like, my head doesn't hurt. I'm not dizzy. I have no symptoms. That was funny." One of my challenges is, how do we navigate this in the cheer industry? And as I was reading it, I felt like every single team needs to have multiple alternates to be prepared for taking kids out for concussion. Like, I don't know if that's the solution, but that's just what I found myself thinking. And then I have another question for you. So how do we navigate being highly competitive and the fact that our sport is a lot of physical contact, with avoiding these kind of ignoring concussions and just being like, well, can you perform?
I mean, I think avoiding concussions is a challenge because, like, as you said, we're in a sport it's a high risk sport, really. You know, that people are going high in the air, so that there is, or even in tumbling, you know, there is risk of catastrophic injury. And so I think the sport has got better in terms of the way that we are coaching and teaching skills progressions to help avoid injuries. I do think that over the years, I've seen improvements in injury rates in certain types of injuries where we've become more attuned to the need for skills progression. And I think that's a conversation that's still going on and is really important to go on. I think just having an awareness that it is a thing might help coaches to, in the way that we train certain skills, you know, is that team really ready to throw that basket yet? Really? Are they really? Do they really should they have a spotter on the back of that, like an extra spotter for a bit longer? Or actually, do we need to go back to basics and they train other skills? You know, we do still rush skills progressions when we, you know, and so there's those kind of basic health and safety that we could improve things on, which is going to make our athletes better in the long run anyway, right? You know, if they've got good, strong skills progressions. Concussion training, so we have an awareness, because there are, like you said, there are some coaches who just be like, you good, get back in, go, and don't do any checks. Don't ask any questions. You know, I think it's important that we ask questions. I think that within that, it's really important that we create an environment for our athletes, where they can say if they're not okay. Because I think there are some training environments where I've heard from athletes, it wasn't okay, but I didn't feel like I could say no. I felt like I had to go again. So how do we create an environment where it's not everyone like, oh, I hurt my finger, I need to sit down every 5 seconds. But how do we create an environment where if something's serious, you do need to tell us and you won't be in trouble. It's important that we know if you are feeling dizzy or sick, to sit down. And then the other thing in this is about our reporting processes, because are we making a note in our medical log when that happens to someone? Are we then passing that information on if that kid is in multiple classes throughout a gym day? Maybe they've hit their head in their first training session, but then they're going to be tumbling in 2 hours time, or they have a private later. Has that information been communicated on to the next coach that's working with them, so they are watching out for any, because it can take time for signs of concussions to appear, that they are aware of that. And also from that kind of risk liability perspective, have we reported it? Have we done the things medically that we can or should be doing? It's not completely avoidable, but there are things that we can do to mitigate risk. And the conversation that's happening a little bit with gym owners here in the UK is around use of wearing helmets or not. A big thing in rugby in the UK at the moment are these kind of halo bands that you can get. Halo is a brand, but these bands that help support against micro concussions, which they look like sweatbands that go around the head. What's helpful? What's a hindrance? Yeah, so I think a combination of those things to help mitigate risk. We can't completely eliminate risk if we want to do the skills that we want to do in our sport.
Right. There is always that pulling off of the Band-Aid moment of like, okay, now it's time to do it. But yes, the progression and making sure things are safe is so critical. But even 6 months into a season, a skill that's hit 100 times can go awry and be a bad catch or be a fall. You touched on something of talking to kids. One of the things I want to encourage any coaches listening to, or owners to educate their coaches on, is when you ask a kid and you say, hey, like, how are you feeling? Describe for me. One, I always go with, tell me what you're feeling. Like what's going on? When you ask leading questions, are you dizzy? Mm-hmm. You're leading them to yes or no. So describe for me how you're feeling. What's going on? And then they'll give you hopefully some answers. But when you ask an athlete, I just had this happen with an athlete the other night on my world's team, and we compete for a world's bid this weekend. And she kind of had a fall, and she reached, and she didn't have a fall. She got caught, but she reached her hand down, and she was like, her elbow hurt. And I was like, where are we at? I don't know. Okay, well, I don't know means no, right? Like, I don't know means no, we're not going back in. And we waited a little bit, and then we ended up getting an x-ray. She was fine. Great. Wonderful. Love it. But if you have an athlete and you say, hey, are you good to go back in? And they're like, I don't know, then that's a no. It needs to be a like, yeah, I'm good. It's a little sore, or I'm 100%. And you need to evaluate your athletes, because you have those go-getters who are going to say, I'm good. Meanwhile, they're, walking crooked because they've got a broken finger and they're like, I'm good, coach. Like, don't worry about it. And you're like, no, that's a problem. I wanted to ask you about the micro concussions. I'm developing a theory, and I don't know if there's anything related to this. I am noticing more and more athletes who are struggling with more kind of sudden onset mental blocks on tumbling, especially more complex tumbling skills, tend to be flyers, and tend to be flyers who've had more than one like issue that maybe wasn't a concussion, but was like a pretty decent fall in relatively close proximity, and then mental blocks on tumbling, which aren't related to their stunting, occurring. And I'm just wondering if there's any data that shows that repeated kind of micro concussion could be a cause of that happening. Because these aren't kids who have the standard like anxiety performance issue. It's just like out of nowhere, all of a sudden they're like, can't twist. And I've had like 4 or 5 happen that I'm just starting to wonder if there's some correlation there.
I mean, that's interesting. I don't know. I think that is the challenge in our sport, is that our sport is multi-sport, right? Because they're flying, then they're doing completely different skill set. So I think, micro concussion data is still quite limited. The most research has been done in rugby and American football, and they're doing the same thing repeatedly to themselves, whereas our kids are doing one thing, then something seemingly completely unrelated. And correlation, causation, not necessarily the same thing, but it's interesting that you've noticed that. I'd be really curious I might go away and have a conversation with a couple of sports scientists about that. Maybe that's the first piece of data, that research that needs to be done in our sports science, that needs to be done in our sport.
Well, so we've talked a lot about, I don't know if you've talked about this a lot, but there's a lot of conversation of like, why are there so many more mental blocks? Like, it seems like mental blocks are spreading, that they're more common than they were a decade ago. Everyone says COVID. It was lockdowns that messed our kids' brains up. Okay. I mean, could it have had an impact? Absolutely. But I don't know. That's not ringing as true to me as there's something else happening. And the thing I lean towards is our sport has evolved. So we're pushing so much harder skills on these kids. We're throwing things so much higher. We're adding in these like really difficult skills at younger and younger ages. And I think that leads towards more of these micro concussions that we don't even notice, because we're throwing these kids higher. We're catching them harder. We're doing these more unique, wild things. And I'm wondering if we're having a long-term impact. Again, this is all theory. As I was reading it,
it's a theory, but it's an interesting one that I think has legs. I mean, I think also we have seen an increased level of generalized anxiety amongst teenagers and young people. Partly, sure, COVID, also the advent of social media. There's a huge volume of information. Our brains were never meant to be tuned in to receiving so much information all the time. When it comes to social media, I think that there's a lot of things going on. I do think that's really interesting, and I do think it comes back to that idea that we need to be thinking about cheerleading as a sport, and if it's a sport, then it should have sports science research backing it up, evidence-based work, both in terms of then how we are progressing and pushing skills, but also how we're keeping kids safe in the sport. And it's just not evolved at the same rate. And part of that is, where people think it's important to put their money.
100%. Yeah, people spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best choreography and music, but when you're like, hey, it'll be $1,000 for a training on how to keep your athletes safe, it's like, I don't know if it's in the budget, because we don't budget for it, which would be something so we've been going for almost an hour and a half, and I truly appreciate your time. I want to make my recommendation, which is, if you haven't read Squad Safe, you need to read it. I'm not joking when I say this is probably one of the most important books written for the cheer industry, because I wrote a book, and mine is really important for how to charge what you're worth and how to set your pricing. Danielle's book is great for running a gym, but like, this applies to the entire industry, and it's important for whatever country you're in. We all need to be thinking about this stuff for our athletes, because they are the backbone. There is no industry without athletes to train, and it's our job to take care of them. So that's number one. Read this book. I had a number two, but I cannot remember. As we close, are there any parting thoughts, anything that we didn't get to that you want to make sure that you put out there for the listeners?
I just think it's important for us to, when we talk about safeguarding, when we talk about athlete welfare, to remember that we all want the same thing, that we all fell in love with this sport because we know that it's incredible, and we know what it can give young people, and we're passionate about it. We all want that same thing, and that to think about these elements doesn't take away from any other aspects of cheer that we might be interested in. It only serves to enhance. This can be I think this is a really exciting all the stuff that we've been talking about to do with sports science and female health. This is an exciting next leveling up in our sport. It's not oh god, it's another thing to think about. If your motivation is about, how do I, what is that incremental, what are the small wins, that the gains, the small gains that are going to edge it, this is the area I think that is going to, edge teams in the sport and edge those gyms, because, I think it's exciting. I want us to have an incredible, I had an incredible experience in the sport. I want other young people to have that experience. And I don't want, negative environments to be a barrier to young people experiencing cheer. And I don't believe that coaches do either.
I love that. Yeah, 100%. And it is exciting, especially for nerdy people like me who are like, oh, I love to analyze things and get into it. It is very exciting. For those who want more information, who would like to potentially get some training from Squad Safe or engage more with your company, how should they find you? How should they reach out?
So you can reach me at my website, which is www.squadsafe.org. Did I put enough W's in that? Yeah, www.squadsafe.org. And they can also reach me on Instagram. I'm at Joanna Gamper Cuthbert _author. I did that because there may be another book. Dan.
Volume
rather
2,
than
how
being
to actually do it.
Squad Safe. But yeah, and on Instagram and Facebook, the Facebook is Squad Safe, but on the Instagram, I do little short reels giving people tips, thoughts, ideas, things they could go like. Individual thing you can go away and implement in your gym, if you're feeling overwhelmed by like, oh my gosh, where might I start? So yeah, that's how
great.
You can find me.
That's great, because this can feel overwhelming. It can feel overwhelming if you haven't done the work you haven't done any work on this yet, and you read this book, you're going to be like,
do you know what? I've had a couple of gym owners who said they bought the book for every one of the coaches in their program, and they're reading it like a book club, and they're doing like an individual topic, like it's chunked in topics intentionally so that you don't have to read it all in one go. You can, take a idea or one practical implementation and do that.
This is actually next on our list to do that exact thing. We did it with Jeff's book at the start of the year. We're reading another book right now, but this is the next one. So I highly recommend that with your staff. Well, Joey, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully you got a ton out of this episode. I may or may not have to bully Joey into coming back because I feel like we could go for another hour or so. Hopefully it wasn't too painful for you.
I loved it. It was nice and challenging. You've given me some things to go away and think about. I'm going to come back next time with a whole research project ready to roll on microconcussions.
I'm here for it. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for listening. And with that, we will catch you on the next episode.